much, Brittany. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. And I just want to start us off by doing some introductions. I'd love to know who is here. So if you could just throw in the chat box your name, where you work, what you do, that would be great. I'll take a minute to introduce myself while you're doing that. As Brittany said, I'm Molly Cook and I work at the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. And a lot of my work is in the area of workforce development. I formerly have spent a lot of my career working in homelessness, specifically with homeless youth. So I was the development director at a family shelter for homeless families. And I also have worked in Detroit, Michigan as a homeless youth case manager. And I'm really excited about our topic today. I found that the amount of work and the quality of services that were able to be provided to youth experiencing homelessness was just so great when I saw those examples of great community collaboration through partnerships with schools and local nonprofits. And so I just want to talk about some of the things that I have noticed and then some of the national research that has been done around this. I also want to learn from you because I know that many of you are already doing this in your local communities and we can all learn from each other. Thank you to everyone who is posting in the chat. I'm seeing we have quite a few college and community college representatives here, some state partners. So I'm really excited to see, and from all over the state, which is fantastic. So I'm really excited to learn from all of you today as well. And thank you so much for continuing to introduce yourselves. I want to start with just one quick review slide. This is the third presentation in a three-part series we've done over the past little over a month or so regarding services for students who are experiencing homelessness. In our first session, we talked about with Julie Radican. She was actually my very first boss when I was working in Detroit with homeless youth. And so she talked to us a lot about McKinney-Vento, about the policies affecting youth experiencing homelessness and students experiencing homelessness. So as a review, McKinney-Vento identifies a homeless youth with under the age of 21 as someone who is lacking fixed, adequate, and regular housing. And it requires that when a student is in high school, for example, that if they're identified as being homeless, they are able to remain in the school they were enrolled in prior to being homeless, that they have reliable transportation to and from school, that they're connected to programs and services to provide assistance. It also requires a McKinney-Vento liaison within school districts to help with identifying students and providing those connections. So then in our next session, which was a couple of weeks ago, we talked about outreach to students experiencing homelessness at colleges and universities, and then what to do once they are identified. So as a reminder, we talked about outreach ideas for within your college classrooms. So a few of those ideas were by providing a statement in the syllabus about where a student could find resources or who they could contact if they did find themselves facing an unstable housing situation. We talked about training for instructors, for individuals working in financial aid who may encounter students experiencing homelessness as they are filling out their FAFSA. We talked about the FAFSA in general because there is an option for students who are identified as runaway youth or homeless youth to file as an independent on their FAFSA, which eliminates some of the paperwork requirements that they may not have. We talked quite a bit about outreach at local high schools as you're working with recruiting students to your programs for post-high school in terms of providing mentorship opportunities, connecting those high school students with students at your colleges or universities to provide them with that mentorship opportunity. We talked about outreach at school lunches at high schools to provide coaching and assistance and resources. And then finally, we talked about community outreach. We talked about attending resource fairs, having information in local libraries about things like applying for FAFSA or attending college. And then we talked about visit days at your colleges and universities. So that's just a quick review of where we've been, and now we're going to keep going on talking about community partnerships today. Oops, sorry, I skipped the slide. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about community asset mapping, continuums of care, partnerships with community agencies, funding, and then we have a whole bunch of examples at the end of this session to talk about. So to see how people really implement the theories and ideas we're talking about. I have two poll questions to start just to get an idea of where all of your organizations and colleges and universities are at as a starting point. So we're going to do two polls to get started. The first poll we have is, does your institution provide referrals for students experiencing homelessness to community agencies? And let me launch that really quickly. So go ahead and take about 30 seconds to answer this question, and then I'll share the results. Okay, wonderful. Let me share this. So it looks like the majority of you are working at institutions where you provide referrals to students experiencing homelessness. That is wonderful. And that gives us a really great foundation to start with. If you're not, then you'll have some ideas by the end of this session. Okay. The next poll we have is, does your institution partner with community agencies to provide housing, food, or programs to your students who are experiencing homelessness? Let me just launch that poll and we'll have another 30 seconds to answer that. All right. So this is amazing and wonderful. It looks like many of you are partnering with community agencies. So I'll be really interested to learn how throughout this session, and we can get ideas from one another. Thank you so much for doing those polls. Just to get started, that's really good to know. So I want to start, I forgot to mention this part. So my educational background is in sociology. So I'm really interested in systems and understanding how to work in homeless services at a large scale, like big picture level. And so we're going to start with a little sociology theory lesson to start. And it really helps, I think, to understand from a large scale, why is it important to connect homeless youth with services? So many of you have already probably heard of this or heard something similar, the idea of social capital. So the reason why it's, for example, McKinney-Vento requires connection to community agencies, why so many of your colleges and universities are already providing connections for youth experiencing homelessness, is to develop this idea of social capital. So social capital is the links, shared values, and understandings in society that enable individuals and groups to trust each other and to work together. And there are three types of social capital, and these really are three types of relationships. And the idea is that we provide these three types of social capital relationships to the students who are in need of additional resources as we're connecting them. So this first type of social capital is bonding social capital. So it's linking people based on a sense of identity. So these will be links to people who are probably already a part of your social group. So from our last session, this is the idea of linking students experiencing homelessness with current student mentors who may have gone through similar situations. Our next type of social capital is bridging social capital. So the idea of this one is that you're linking stretches beyond identity. So this could be, for us, connecting to a friend of a colleague. For the students we're working with here, this will be the connections to the community agencies. So your student may find identity in being a student at your university or your college or your program. But when you link them to a community resource or a community opportunity, you're providing that bridge for them to access additional people, additional resources, additional support. And then finally, we have linkages, and those are the people or groups who help create these bonds and these bridges. So many of you in your positions. So from a research perspective, there has been quite a bit of research done around connecting students experiencing homelessness to community resources. And there's a bunch of different sources at the bottom of this of research that's been done. And so this research is based on an idea called affiliation theory. So it's the idea that you look at the types of bonds that a person has, and that predicts their stability or their access to resources. So for example, if I have a million friends, I'm highly affiliated. I know a lot of people, but we're looking at who my friends are. So if I have tons and tons of friends, but my friends in their, my friends, I have some friends who are involved in human services, some friends who have stable housing, who could house me if I needed to, things like that. I have a higher likelihood of being able to maintain stability in terms of completing my education or finding food or things like that than if I didn't have those connections. So it really looks at the type of bonds. Research has shown that at the time of experiencing homelessness, individuals experiencing homelessness have fewer affiliations. So they may have friends who are also experiencing housing instability, or they may have, for example, in the situation of runaway youth, they may have cut off ties with their family. And so when they are experiencing homelessness, they don't have that extra net to fall back on, which is why that social capital is so important that you're helping to instill at your colleges, because it gives them additional resources. And the example I wanted to share from this right before we get into some examples is that I worked with an agency. It was actually in the western part of the United States, and it was called Mountain Jobs. And so what they did is youth experiencing homelessness would come into the agency, and they'd be referred to from community college or from different programs in the community. And the agency would connect them with a job. So they would have a caseworker at the agency who would work with them on soft skills, finding a job, resume, and then the agency would connect them with an employer that they partner with for employment. And over time, there was a lot of research actually conducted at this program. Over time, it was found that as people were finding a great sense of personal growth and a sense of appreciation from their employer, feeling like they had a connection with their caseworker who could help them finding food or transportation or troubleshoot problems at work, that they were forming those extra bonds with their caseworker. They were able to form bonds with their coworkers, and they were able to, in some cases, they were able to improve family relationships. And so their chances of becoming homeless in the future were decreased over time. And there was an example of one person here who had never considered becoming a homeowner. They wanted to find their stable housing, which was very understandable, and just make sure they had a place to stay each night. They joined a savings program through the nonprofit where they saved a portion of their income each week to put toward housing, and their coworkers would look for for housing postings for them and put them in their mailbox at work. And that's how they were able to find housing, was by saving their money at this nonprofit and then through their coworkers helping them search. And that's just a really good example of the power of connection. So let's talk about forming these connections and how this might happen in your local communities. So the first example I want to give is community asset mapping. And this is really cool. Some of you, I'm sure, have participated in this. So as I'm explaining it, if you've been a part of something similar, please post in the chat. I'd love to hear your experience with it. The idea of community asset mapping is to sit down with a group of people. This could be people in your department, at your college, or at your program. This could be at a larger level, having it be a community process where you call upon local partners, local elected officials. I will say at a college that I worked at, it was a small college, I would say like 2,000 students. We did do this with the entire college community. We did it with staff, faculty, and then a few local community partners. It turned out being about 70 people. It took about 3 hours, and that was one way you can do it. I've seen it with groups of 4 in an office. So whatever works for you. The steps in this process are to identify what your community boundaries are. So identify what, for example, if you're a community college, which communities do you serve in your region? Identify categories and partners. So saying, okay, my region is this 3-county territory. I want to see what resources are available for students experiencing homelessness in the categories of healthcare, education, transportation, childcare, and food. Okay, and you could list a million. So when you determine that, you're going to then think about, who do I want to get input from? So which partners do I want to have here? Which staff members who can tell me which services exist in this region around those categories? And taking it one step further, what quality of services are those and what types? Because you may have 10 food banks, but maybe only 5 would serve your students or your students would be eligible for. I listed a couple of examples of how this might play out in that middle section. So you might invite staff and faculty to complete slips of paper with their connections in various categories, which I listed some of those categories. And that was one that I was a part of. So what we did is, in that case, I told you, at the smaller college with about 60 staff and faculty, everyone got a bunch of little Post-it notes, and they would write down what they knew existed in each of those categories. And further, they would list if they were specifically connected. So let's say there was a hospital and one of your faculty is a board member at that hospital, they would write down, I'm a board member, or my brother works here and I know he's in this department and he would help us. So everyone takes their sticky notes and they post them on a big map of the community so that we can see where all of the resources and connections exist. Another idea, and this is a little bit of a simpler way, is to create an asset map of individuals who work at your institution. So you might create a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet and send it out to people who work at your institution and ask them just to write down, what community organizations are you a part of and what services do they provide? Because chances are some of your staff volunteer or have family members who work at different community resources, and it's a really great way just to see the connections that are already existing. So I want to talk a little bit more about the implementation of this, because this is a really good place to start when we're talking about forming community connections and connecting students experiencing homelessness to services. It's great to know what's out there and what actually exists so that students are getting the full picture. A few more ideas about implementation are focus groups. So I know that staff capacity is often already at max capacity. So I've seen this if there's an intern or even as a student project, like if a class is doing a project, you could do focus groups. So you could sit down with groups of staff or groups of community members to ask them questions about which services and resources exist in the community to connect students experiencing homelessness to. You could come up with a few research questions about, for example, you could send these out to your staff or whichever group you're convening in the form of a survey saying, where do you go if you want to receive healthcare? Where would you send someone if they were food insecure? And that's a really great way to get some of this information. You could do a visual exercise, which is kind of like what you see on the right there in that image. You'll notice I keep looking to my side. I have a double screen here, which is why I keep looking over there. So sorry if I'm confusing with where I'm looking a little bit. But when you look on the right there, that's an example of a group printed out a map, or in this case, they did it online, and they labeled it based on where are places for arts and recreation, to go out to eat, for healthcare. Now, this was just a general one I grabbed. When you're working with students experiencing homelessness, some of these won't apply, but it's an example. You could create a shared document or a map to do something similar like this. So you could do this on paper, on a wall, you could do it on a shared document, or you could create a survey like we just talked about. I wanted to give a few examples of the questions you could ask through a focus group, through research questions, through surveys. If you wanted to do this on a level of, everyone's time is crunched, we can't convene everyone, but we could send out a survey or a few questions. You could ask, what type of blank assets exist in this community? Those assets could be healthcare, transportation, food, housing. You can ask, can we grade these places? Because when you're referring youth to local services, of course, you don't want to refer them somewhere where people have had, maybe they haven't been able to be eligible for services. And what is missing? What else do we need in this community for youth that and for our students that doesn't already exist? And could we offer that here? I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and show you something on, there's a guide for this. And like last time, when I presented last time, all of the links will be shared at the end of this in a comprehensive format. So don't feel like you need to like copy down every link. I'll get those all to you at the end of this session. But this is a guide from the Community Research Lab, and it talks all about participatory asset mapping, which is this same concept. And it's like a multi-step guide, which goes through all of the possible ways you could implement this and many examples. So I just wanted to point this out because I'll share it to you at the end of this session. Okay, I'm going to get back into the PowerPoint. So before I move on to our next topic, are there any questions about this community asset mapping, or anyone have any examples to share of a time when they've done this and maybe it's worked or hasn't worked? I'll just give you a minute to post in the chat if that does apply or if you have questions. Okay, well, please feel free to post in the chat, ask questions if you do have any questions about implementing this. The next section I want to talk about are local partnerships and collaboration opportunities. And at the end of this, I'm going to ask you for what you're already doing, because again, many of you might be doing similar pieces of this. The first place I look when connecting youth who are experiencing homelessness to services is the local continuum of care. So a continuum of care is a local or regional planning group of homeless service providers and services to individuals experiencing homelessness who meet to coordinate their services. So a continuum of care would typically consist of a local community action agency, homeless shelters, food banks, healthcare systems, transportation facilities, and things of that nature. They're largely responsible for the outreach, intake, and assessment of individuals experiencing homelessness. And the approach many of these continuums of care use are the no wrong door approach. So the idea that if I go to a shelter down the road to get assistance, I'll be entered into a coordinated entry system so that when I go to the food bank, I don't have to retell my story. My information is still in the system. Continuums of care coordinate emergency shelters, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and point-in-time counts. And point-in-time counts, they occur every year, often in January, and it's a point where communities take a census of individuals who are homeless and unsheltered. So, well, it's both sheltered and unsheltered, but a lot of the efforts you may hear about are unsheltered because you may see that they're asking for volunteers to go out in the community and find people who are currently not in shelter. And this is where funding from the US Department of Housing and Urban Development often comes from. Typically, your continuum of care will be organizing that annual count. I am going to show you another resource really quickly because when you're coordinating these resources and looking to refer students, a continuum of care is just a great starting point because they have a really good idea of what the services available are. So here are some continuum of care contacts by state. And I pulled up the Illinois contact list so that you can find your local continuum of care and go ahead and contact them. And I'll provide you this link later in the session as well. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that this was here and you could contact your local continuum of care. I want to give you an example. I chose one from the list. I chose Heartland Continuum of Care. And this image actually is not from Heartland Continuum of Care. It's from South Plains Continuum of Care in another area of the Midwest. But if you go to their page, for example, as you're looking for your continuum of care, you can see a lot of what they do. On Heartland's website, they collect local data regarding housing. They have a resource page for you to use to refer people to. They offer grants, often Continuum of Care groups offer local level grants for either housing or service provisions. So it's a good place to look for funding. And they also have a list of committee members, which is hugely helpful because then you can see which service providers are a part of that continuum of care to get an idea of what is out there. Okay, so another place that you can form connections and partnerships are at local shelters. And a really good place to start is to learn about the population your shelter serves. A lot of shelters are population specific, as you know, so some will be women's only, men's only, family oriented. So learn what the requirements are and what the population served are so that when you're showing options to students, they know which shelters they're qualified for. Additionally, it's not a bad idea to call and ask for the shelter prioritization. So what I mean by that is the family shelter that I worked at, we were a shelter for all families, but we did have a prioritization list based on which other shelters were available in the community. So for example, in the community I was working in, there was no homeless shelter that existed for single fathers with children. There were shelters that existed for single men, but not single fathers with children. So if somebody called who was eligible for another shelter and then somebody called who was a single father with a child, we would prioritize having them be admitted versus the other family because we could refer them to another shelter who could take them. Another example in our community was there was no shelter for families who had an adult child who had a physical or cognitive disability and their parent was the primary caregiver. So for example, someone who stayed at our shelter, it was a mom, she was about 40 and she had a 26-year-old son who she was the primary caregiver for because he had a cognitive disability. And so there was no other shelter that they could be together at. And so we would prioritize having them come in. So a lot of times you can find that out by calling the shelter, and I would encourage you to do that because then you'll be able to refer the students you're working with to the shelter who has the highest likelihood of having an availability for them. Good idea to ask about and learn about the support offered at shelters. So some shelters offer case managers, some offer education classes, some offer transportation. So find out about that. Find out about other services that your students can receive just by being referred to this shelter. So when you're looking at partnering with a shelter, let's say that you've learned about a shelter, you've talked to them, you've talked to their staff, and you think you could have a really strong partnership. Some ideas for how to partner with shelters are to provide scholarships. If there is a family shelter in your community and there's students living at that shelter with their families who are in high school, provide scholarships to those students or a scholarship competition. You can partner with that shelter's donors. And so, for example, many shelters have individual donors who are in close relationship with their development directors or their executive directors. And so a lot of times what I would find is that those donors want to continue to make their impact and they're looking for ways to get involved. So providing an opportunity where you know of a student who is maybe staying at a shelter and needs help paying tuition or needs help with books or food or anything, talking to some of those individual donors with the shelter. Often you may find that professors or instructors at local colleges and universities become members of local board of directors at shelters or other agencies. So if there is someone who works at your school who is on the board of directors for one of these shelters, it's really good to be connected to that person. And then finally, you can always have your students go and volunteer at these shelters through internships or through other opportunities. And it's just never a bad idea to be good community partners with them. Okay, so I want to take a pause to do a chat really quickly. So if you could post in the chat box, is your institution, program, agency connected with a local shelter? And if so, how have you formed that connection or what is that connection? So if you could post in the chat box, I'll give us about a minute or so here to look for those responses.
And so Molly, while they're posting in the chat, I do kind of just want to point out and maybe get some wheels turning here, especially for individuals that are joining us that are involved with Perkins 5. Both the secondary and post-secondary system through Perkins 5 do comprehensive local needs assessments. And it is sort of that continuous improvement process for those entities. And when you were talking about the mapping of the services, while it may not go that in depth, I think it's a great extension of that, because that comprehensive local needs assessment is really looking at the programs that these entities are providing and making sure that they are meeting the needs and demands of the local workforce and the economy, but also looking at improving that access and equity within their programs. And we know that wraparound services for students is a huge component when it comes to retaining our students, when it comes to their success moving through our programs. And so this would be a great extension of that comprehensive local needs assessment. And we already know that you're bringing in stakeholders to have those conversations. You have those advisory committees that should be bringing in stakeholders as well. So when we're talking about that, not just looking at workforce and local agencies in that sense, but also those entities that are providing those wraparound services, making sure that they are being involved and at the table and having those conversations with them, because it's so important for the success of our students.
That is such a great idea. Thank you so much for adding that, Brittany. And I like the idea of adding on to something that's already happening. Okay, so we'll go on to our next connection. We have about 2 more connections, and then we're going to go into funding. Another idea is food banks. And I remember from our last session, many of you noted that some of your institutions offer mobile food banks or offer campus food banks for students. That's so amazing. So that's a great idea. It's another good practice to make sure that students have access to food during school closures, like holiday breaks. And that can be done by, again, partnering with local food banks or even providing that mobile food bank during closures. I posted a picture here of a little free pantry. I was reading an article, and some community college campuses have started this, where it's like the little free libraries you might see as you walk around your communities, where people can bring and put their non-perishables, and then people can take them if they need it. I was reading that an institution did food box pickups. And they did this prior to school closures, where students could sign up in advance, come by and pick up a box of food for themselves for during that closure. And they developed a recipe collection, which I linked to it there. So when you get this PowerPoint later, you can link to it, where they then created a Google Doc of recipes available to students with the food in that box. They did note that a key to that was making sure there was a place on campus to prepare and store that food, because students who are facing housing insecurity may not have access to things like a refrigerator or a microwave. So making sure students know where those resources are on campus. And then finally, there are some grant opportunities available to increase food security on your local campuses, from both national resources and then sometimes from places like your local community foundation or local foundations. I posted a few links to that I will share with you at the end of this session. So the last connection I want to talk about right now are I combined those 2 words, public-private partnerships. So this is the idea of those programs that are funded by public dollars as well as private dollars. So this could happen through relationships with landlords. So maybe you have a partnership, maybe someone at your school, maybe an instructor or a board member knows a local landlord that you could partner with to make sure that they, maybe they'll be able to provide subsidized housing for some of your students. Maybe they'll let you know when there is an opening that's affordable. Making sure there's housing availability on campus or during your breaks, or if you don't have on-campus housing, which can be more rare at community colleges, maybe you have a partnership with a hotel for school closures, or maybe you have people in your community who volunteer to have students temporarily stay with them. A really cool program I saw was a campus emergency fund. So this is done by having a fund at your campus that staff or faculty or students can contribute to, so that when a student does face an immediate emergency, they can apply to receive funds from this pool of money that's been provided by the community. So maybe they can't make rent this month. They could apply for funding from this pool of money to then be able to make rent. And finally, partnerships with public transportation. In the community I was in, the local public transit, the bus, they donated a certain amount of bus tokens each month to the local community college and to the local homeless shelters for students experiencing homelessness to be able to use that transportation. There are a ton of additional partnerships that you can have within your community. I listed some here. You could partner with high schools, libraries, medical facilities, churches, and other colleges and universities. And I'm sure many of you are doing this. So there are many additional partnerships. The most important thing, as you know, is just making sure students have access to what they need and to stay in your programs and complete your programs and have a holistic view and be able to have access to food and housing and security. And so however you connect and however you achieve that, it will look different in each community. I want to talk for a moment before we brainstorm together about how to fund some of these opportunities, because some of these partnerships can be greatly increased or greatly bettered with additional funding, or may not even be able to happen without funding. A few ideas that we have on funding opportunities are, again, grant partnerships. So often grants at the federal, the state level, the local level really like to see collaboration. So talking to some of those nonprofits about how you might partner to apply for some grant funding. Maybe it's applying to have food opportunities on campus that benefit both individuals who live at a shelter and students, and you'd apply for a joint grant. Donors, working with your development staff, your advancement office at your college is really helpful to, if you wanted to launch a special program, if you wanted to develop a more robust emergency fund, working with the donors that you already have at your university or college or program. You're trying to build out some of these programs and systems, you can always look into AmeriCorps to be able to find a capacity building volunteer to be able to come to your college or university and take on this project for a year period, for example. It's much more affordable than hiring a full-time staff, and it's time durational. And their work is, if it's an AmeriCorps Vista, is focused on capacity building. Cool movement that has started are giving circles. You may find these in your local community. They're groups of people who often gather quarterly, and they commit to $100 quarterly. So what happens at their meetings is that a nonprofit comes, or about 5 nonprofits come, they explain their mission, they explain what they're doing, and then the group votes on who they want to give their funding to. So each member has brought $100 for that quarter, and if there's 100 members, that adds up quickly. And you could go to one of these giving circles and talk about a program you want to provide or funding you want to provide for your students experiencing homelessness. And then finally, as I mentioned before, interns. Interns are a great way to be connected with local nonprofits or to expand your programs. Okay, we're going to try something high tech here. We're going to see if we can do this together. If you have any issues with accessing the link that I'll put in the chat in a moment for this activity, please feel free to post in the chat. It will be just the same, so do not fear. So we're going to do a Jamboard, which is like a Google Doc, and I want to take a moment to learn which community partnerships you have in place for students experiencing homelessness, or which community partnerships you hope to establish. So please feel free to share as many ideas, as many thoughts as you have. We'll take a couple minutes to do this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to bring up this Jamboard and put the link for all of you in the chat. Okay. So you should see the link to the Jamboard. Please go ahead and try to access that. I'm going to share it on my screen. If you have any problems accessing it at all, no worries, just post your thoughts in the chat. And I'll also write on the Jamboard our discussion question. And I just realized I just made it so that anyone with the link can only view and not post. So I'm changing that access option right now. Okay, you know what? I did not, I made it so you can only view only, and I'm having a hard time changing it at the moment. So let's go ahead and just do this in the chat box. And I will post the questions we're looking at right now, but we're looking at which community partnerships you have in place for students experiencing homelessness, or which community partnerships do you hope to establish? So if you could share with us your ideas, that would be great. And I'll put this question in the chat box right now. Okay, so that is right there in the chat. So feel free to go ahead and put your responses in there. Thanks, Lacey. Lacey said that they have a Salvation Army to provide work appropriate clothes for students. Oh, that's a really cool idea. So that they can do interviews. That's awesome. Brittany said community action agencies have a lot of resources. Yeah, they're full of resources. Tracy shared a website that has links. That's great. Thanks. I see that Tanya partnered with the Greater Chicago Food Depository to help students apply for SNAP. Oh, that's awesome. Cool. Anna said, we are working to set up a focus group with organizations that work with people experiencing homelessness. This will include transportation, food, clothing, housing. Great. Claire said, on campus, we have a staff member that is the point person for a student dealing with homelessness. They are connected to many community resources that our students can tap into. That's very cool, Claire. Claire, is that, do you work at a community college, or what sort of institution do you work at? That sounds a lot like a McKinney-Vento liaison, which we see a lot at the high school level. And it's awesome that if you are at a college, that's awesome that you have it at the college level. So if you could get a chance to share that with us, I'd be really curious to hear.
Well, and Molly, I also believe that there was a bill that just passed that starting in August of 2022, that the homelessness liaison will also be, we already know in the secondary system, it's a necessity. Within higher ed, it will start being a requirement as well for community colleges and all of the higher ed entities also.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah, and I see, Claire, you did say that you work for a grant located at a community college. Oh, that's great. Very cool. Thank you, both Brittany and Claire, for sharing that. We see that Jamil provides referrals to local housing authorities. That's wonderful. Evelyn shared with us a link. Oh, that's great. It looks like it's a news article. And then I see there's a connection to Housing Authority, Salvation Army, Community Action. I love hearing from all of you. Please continue to post in the chat. I know we can all learn so much from one another. So happy to see these resources, and thank you so much for sharing. Oh yeah, and then I see Tanya just posted that you get students connected to community resources. Housing is the hardest. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like in many communities, from what I've read, there is quite a long housing wait list, and housing is just hard to find in general right now. So I can only imagine that your community connections are really essential in your position right now. Okay, so we're going to talk about some models and examples, just different ways that communities are implementing some of these connections in the next few slides. Again, you've provided many models and examples, so I hope we draw on each other as well. So this is the idea that Brittany just mentioned of having advocates, navigators, liaisons at your colleges and universities, and they are so helpful with assisting with identifying housing. Tanya, it sounds like in your role, that's largely what you do is getting students connected with resources and housing, providing rental subsidies or connecting to rental subsidies, providing case management. So a lot of this is just making sure that there's follow-up with students and a point person for additional information. Helping with connecting to peer navigators and a housing first model. So the housing first model that many shelters are participating in right now promotes the idea that when someone is experiencing homelessness, the first step is to get them into stable housing and then provide those wraparound services. Another example I have here is of a public-private partnership. So this is from the Community College of Philadelphia. I came across this article and they partnered with the Philadelphia Housing Authority to renovate 2 houses for their students. And the houses have a capacity of about 16 students each. They renovated these houses within walking distance to campus, and students pay about 30% of their income for rent each month, up to $125. So it sounds like many of you partner already with your housing authorities. So I'd be curious to hear what those partnerships look like for you as well. There's an example of 2 community colleges. These are both on the east side of the country talking about on-campus housing. They, through donor funds, they had from their advancement office, donors paid for free room and board for some of their students, but it's tied to academic requirements. So students were required to receive, I believe it was a 3.0 GPA. So the state provided $48,000 per campus to cover the cost of 5 beds. And then they received a block grant from the Department of Higher Ed. And then the donors paid for additional support for those students as well. An example of financial support comes from Columbus State Community College. So qualifying students can receive rent and utility assistance for 4 months, averaging about $1,800 per student. And then 24 students are placed in housing with subsidies from the local housing authority. So this is an example of the more emergency type housing assistance because students are eligible for those 4 months. So I know that we talked a little bit about connecting to housing. So I want to wrap us up by talking about which programs or services do you think are difficult for students experiencing homelessness in your community to access? And I end on this note, and I'm going to wrap us up on this note before providing a few resources, because I think that's a good creative starting point, a good brainstorm of, we talked a lot about, what you have in place and what's available, but what could happen to just take things to the next level and make sure your students have all they need? So I heard housing can be a challenging connection. What other programs or services can be challenging? Oh, I see, getting vital records. Yeah, that is really hard, especially if students, experience homelessness due to a natural disaster or due to having to leave a housing situation really quickly. And that can be challenging. And that is a good place probably for those nonprofit connections, because I know there are navigators often within nonprofit agencies that help with getting vital records, getting birth certificates, getting licenses, things like that. So yeah, vital records we talked about housing. And those are, again, great things that if you're realizing those are difficult for your students, taking those to your faculty, to your staff, to your community partners and asking, how do we make this a little easier for our students? Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to have some time. We're going to have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. And I just wanted, this will be on your last slide. So all of the examples we talked about are from a link that if you click here, when you get to slides, you'll see. There's a great website that goes through examples and best practices for community colleges, and many of the examples were from that link. There is contact information for the Illinois resources I discussed here if you're looking to get connected. And then I made a Padlet with all of the links in one place from this presentation. So let me share with you the link for that. But as I'm sharing with you the link for that, please do, I have time for questions. We have about 10 minutes left. So any questions you have, please feel free to post in the chat or raise your hand, and we'd love to address those. And I just posted that Padlet in the chat, so you can go ahead and whenever you want to click on that, all of the resources and links from today are on there. And also thank you for everyone who shared your programs and the work you're doing. That's really awesome to hear about and really helpful to us. Thank you, Brittany, for the information you added. That was so helpful. So thanks everyone for your participation. That was great.
Molly, thank you so much for taking the time to provide this information and present this webinar for us. I see that Michael just put a link to Peoria Public Schools, and looks like based on the title there, some of the wraparound services they provide. So yeah, this has been some great sharing of resources. If anyone on the webinars have attended sessions that we have done, ICSPS has done on special populations in general, you know that partnership is always the sort of drum that we beat when we talk about supporting our students, because we know that whether it's a community college or a high school or secondary institution, there is only so much financially, staff-wise, that we can provide and you guys can provide. And so making sure that we are partnering with our local entities and services close to us to help those students and provide those additional wraparound students that, you know, we just at times aren't able to provide for them. So I am not seeing any additional questions or comments coming in the chat, and I'm not seeing anybody's hand raised. So again, I will just thank you, Molly, for your time, and thank you to everyone that is on the webinar today.